going to talk to us about the new FCC exposure rules and how they can affect all of us ham radio operators and what the radiation might mean for us. So, Greg, I'll turn it over to you and take it away. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. I have a prepared speech, which I usually give to talk to hams about how to follow the rules, the new rules, and which are an extension of the old rules that go all the way back to 1996. But when I read the description of this talk in your newsletter, I saw that there's a lot of interest in why we need such rules and how valid are these rules. So I've given talks like that before as well, and as long as I have enough time, I'll try to touch on both things. So let me get started. Let's see, we'll start with the FCC rules. So let me see how to do this. If I can share. Perfect. Okay, you should see the slides. Is that
We do.
good? Okay, so the rules changed in 2021, and like many things that the FCC does, they give everybody about 2 years to get used to the new rules. So May 3rd, 2023 was the end of that 2-year period. So that was a very important one for hams. I published a reminder in QST about that, a little article. And at this point, everybody is responsible for following these rules. So let's go into what they are. First of all, I've actually spent much of my life in the Chicago area, but I started out in Connecticut, where I was a one-call. And I have chaired the AWRL RF Safety Committee since 1998. I also am the co-chair of the subcommittee 4 of the IEEE International Committee on Electromagnetic Safety, which in essence is the IEEE Standards Committee that generates the safety standard for RF. And I'll talk a little about its history. I also have belonged for actually decades to the IEEE Committee on Man and Radiation. And we're always talking about changing the name to something that doesn't say man for today's world. I have also represented AWRL at the FCC at their Technological Advisory Council. And in fact, I'm leaving tomorrow for Washington to go to another meeting there. And I mostly retired, but I do consulting on RF exposure issues. And if you want to ask any questions directly to me, you can speak up tonight, or you can send me an email at n9gl@awrl.org or at comcast.net or awrl.net. All of those get to me. So back in 1998, that was the end of the 2-year period after the FCC passed their 1996 RF exposure rules, which was the first time that hams ever had to follow RF exposure rules. So by 1998, every ham had to do it. AWRL responded by publishing a book called RF Exposure and You. It's out of print, but it's still available on the AWRL website as a PDF, and it's free. But, and this is the URL to get that, just keep in mind that it's not the same as today's rules. It's fairly close, but the rules have changed since then. In 2020, on April 1st of all dates, in the Federal Register, the new FCC rules were passed that changed those old 1996 rules. The new rules were supposed to take effect June 1st, 2020, but they were delayed till May 3rd of 2021, and as I said before, we had, any existing station had 2 years to comply, so that was this past May. However, they said anyone who sets up a new station after May 3rd, 2021, or change their existing station, then they'd have to comply immediately. And the rules, if you know anything about FCC rule parts, we are part 97, but all these different rule parts were affected by this rule change. One of the main reasons for the rule change was the FCC had separate rules for every service. Cell phones were different than ham radio, were different than broadcasters, and they wanted to make one set of rules that applied to everyone. So that was the major reason for this change in 2021. Part 1 and 2 contain all the mathematical parts, and Part 97 tells how hams have to follow them. Back in '98, they were worried that hams wouldn't be able to follow all those new rules, unlike companies that could hire consultants and testing labs that do all kinds of testing, and they still do, and they spend a lot of money on it. They didn't really want to put that onus on hams, so they made things called categorical exclusions. And I'm talking about these now even though they don't exist anymore, because that's one of the things that disappeared, because a lot of hams after 1998 decided they didn't have to follow any or do anything special to meet the exposure regulations because they were excluded. Things like mobile transmitters didn't have to be concerned. Your handheld didn't have to be concerned about that. And anything with the lower power than a certain amount, which I'll show you in a second, didn't. So most people on HF didn't even have to worry about it. So now that's all gone away. And the new exemption, they have a new exemption, but to be exempt from doing a full analysis, you have to do a little analysis. So it really doesn't save you much. They also changed that any antenna within 20 centimeters of the body, it's about 7 to 8 inches, has to be evaluated with SAR. I'll talk to you about what SAR is and why that is difficult for us. And the other thing that they changed is that exposure has to be determined from the shortest distance from any part of the antenna to any part of a person. So if you have a big beam up on a tower, you don't, under the old rules, they called it the center of radiation. So usually that's where the feed point is. So wherever your coax goes into the driven element of your beam, that's where you would measure the distance to a person. And that really didn't make a lot of sense at HF because some of the distances could have put you inside the antenna. You could have been between the reflector and the director and still been within the exposure regulations, and that doesn't really make sense. Now this is something you may have seen. Let me go to the biology a little bit. So MPE is what the FCC calls maximum permissible exposure. That's the highest exposure in air that you can be placed with. Now, that's a variable because in reality, what the standards say is the SAR. The SAR stands for specific absorption rate. And that's the amount of power per kilogram of body weight that your body can absorb and you'll still be safe. And these numbers here, 0.4 watts per kilogram over your whole body is the maximum. 8 watts per kilogram over 1 gram of tissue, or 20 watts per kilogram over 10 grams of tissue in the parts of your body that aren't that sensitive, like your hands and wrists and feet and ankles. So that's very difficult to measure. SAR, you'd have to actually go inside the body and measure how much is getting absorbed in your tissue. And that's hard to do. So what they what the standards did is they set up an MPE, an exposure in the air, which is easier to measure. I should say easy to measure, and also to model. Anyone can model an MPE, or I should say a power density in air from a free program on your PC. But the problem is that your body absorbs different frequencies at different rates. So to have a constant SAR in your body, it varies with frequency. And you can see here at the very low frequencies, and the rough rule of thumb is, just like an antenna, what are you resonant to? So you're resonant to something near the wavelength. So when the wavelength is very different than your body size, like down at the low frequencies, down at below 80 meters, that's when you can be exposed to the most energy and still meet that SAR limit. As the frequency goes up, the wavelength is approaching some of your body dimensions, and you can absorb more for less exposure. So you'll be exposed to less in the air, and more of it will be absorbed in your body. So the safe limit drops. Mainly in the VHF region, 30 to 300, that's when your body is most efficient at absorbing RF. So that's where the safe limits are lowest. And then as the wavelengths get much smaller than your body dimensions, and by body dimension, for whole body, I'm talking about height, and there are different tissues in your body, different organs that have sizes that might be higher absorbers. But as you go up in frequency, you get less and less efficient in absorbing. So you can be exposed to more RF in the air and still meet these SAR limits. And then once you get up into the gigahertz, that's when your body stops absorbing it all and the stuff all gets stopped at your skin. So then now we're talking about mostly energy that has been stopped or completely absorbed just under the top layer of your skin. And as you can see, we're approaching light. And that's what we know about light. Light doesn't pass through your body, it stops at your skin. So you'll notice there are two different lines here. One is for occupational exposure, or it's sometimes called controlled exposure, and the other is called uncontrolled exposure, or general population. So people who know that they're being exposed, and they know that how they can do about their exposure, like moving away from the antenna, like you stop transmitting for a little while if you feel yourself getting warm, things like that. That's called the occupational or controlled population. And they can be exposed to a little more because they can control it. People who don't know that they're being exposed and wouldn't know what to do about it if they did know, that's the general public, and their limits are much lower. They can be exposed all day long, and there will be no effects to them at these levels. Now, obviously, it's nicer for hams if we're considered occupational, so we are. The FCC said that hams and their families, and they actually changed that to hams and occupants of their house. So if you have someone living in your house who's not your family, that also counts. They are considered in the occupational or controlled category, so they can be exposed at higher levels. And you have some control over how much exposure they get. Now, why are we considered occupational or controlled? One of the reasons the FCC agreed to do that is they put some questions in the question pool about exposure. And when you study for a test, you have to have studied some of those questions, in theory, in order to pass that test. Usually only one safety question ends up on any one test, but the theory is that you've read them all. So you learn something. And once you've learned something about it, they consider you trained and occupational. So that's good for us. Now, we're expected to form our own exposure analyses. We do not have to submit them to the FCC, but if anyone, and especially with all the stuff on the internet, of people saying how dangerous RF is, so you've got a neighbor who sees your antenna, and they, especially if they don't like the look of your antenna and they want to get rid of it, they might call up the FCC and say, I'm worried about my exposure. So the FCC, what they would do in that case is they contact you and say there was a complaint, and all you have to do is come up with your exposure analysis and show them that you did what you were supposed to do and your neighbors are not being overexposed, and they'll drop it right there. So it's good protection for us to do those exposure analyses and keep a record of what you did. Now, very quickly, the categorical exclusions, these were in the old rules. So if you look at these power limits, and this is the power at the antenna, so if you have any feed line loss, that counts in your favor. But if you operate on these bands and you don't use more than this amount of power, you never had to do an analysis.
That's right.
So that's why there's so many hams that haven't done them. But these are gone. They got rid of this whole section. Now, as I said before, mobile, portable, any unlicensed transmitting devices, they were categorically excluded. So that's not true anymore either. Where that's important is that no one has probably measured the SAR of your HT. And your HT is most definitely, or most likely, held within 20 centimeters of some part of your body. Now, the categorical exclusions, they always said you can be excluded from doing an analysis, but you are not excluded from meeting the MPE limits. I think that was a nice thing to say, but it really didn't mean very much because of what does it mean? If you don't do the analysis, you'll never know if you're complying or not. So now we all have to do the analysis. If, though, in the past you performed an environmental assessment of your station, and they haven't changed that part of it. So you are, all the limits are the same as they always were. They just change who has to do them. So if you did it before, you're done. You've already gotten your environmental assessment, and you don't have to do any more. If you didn't do it because of categorical exclusions, you should be doing it now. And I will go over how simple it is so it doesn't have to sound as scary as it sounds. Now, all mobile radios were excluded previously, and that included handheld radios, which we all have. They have new exemptions that are based on distance and the amount of power and the amount of gain your antenna has. So you can do those FCC exemptions, but I'll show you why we're not even recommending that anymore because it's so easy to do it, the full assessment. Now, what I mentioned before, the dates, May 3rd was the date when every ham has to have done it, or should have done it. So how do you do your assessment? Let me shorten this a bit. You need to know certain things. You need to write down all the frequency bands you're going to be using, what modulation types you're going to be using, what power levels you're going to be using, and how do you operate. Do you contest mostly? Do you have rag shoes with your friends? That can have an effect as well. You also should know the gain of your antenna at each band. So you have to re-perform this analysis for each one of those bands that you operate on. Now, I mentioned about the general population, the occupational. I don't have to reiterate that, but one of the differences also is averaging is an important thing. RF that you absorb does not affect you immediately, because most of it just turns into heat, and we're mainly concerned with you getting too much heat inside your body, which doesn't sound like too terrible a thing, but if you think about having 104 fever, that is a terrible thing. So all of the calculations of exposure are based on that. How can your body get rid of the heat that's being generated by the RF being absorbed in your body? There's a 6-minute averaging time for occupational population, or us, and a 30-minute averaging time at much lower limits for the general population. There's two different kinds of averaging that you have to do. When you transmit with a certain modulation, the power that your radio is putting out is not the total power that's going into the air, because your modulation is making the levels go up and down and up and down. So it's really a portion of your carrier power based on the type of modulation. Let's say FM is 100%, because that's always at the same amplitude all the time. But single sideband or AM are going up and down and up and down. So that decreases the amount of averaging that occurs. Also, how do you talk? You talk and you listen. Nobody talks all the time. I know a couple who do, but there's not many of us, because our whole purpose is to have a conversation. So there's a transmit-receive duty cycle as well that you can calculate in. And both of those allow you to transmit more power and give people less of an exposure. So there's an FCC exemption. It's the simplest way to calculate, but they don't let you use it close to the antenna. Well, lambda over 2 pi is called the reactive near field. And that's pretty close, except with very long wavelengths. So that could be a concern. They don't distinguish between occupational and general population, so you could fail their calculation and still be within the limits, but you'd have to do a different type of calculation. They also don't account for the modulation duty cycle, and they don't account for the transmit-receive duty cycle. And they also treat the antenna gain as being in all directions. If you have a high-gain antenna, it's only high gain in the main beam. If you're standing under the antenna, you're not getting the exposure that this calculation would say that you are. Now, I won't go into the reactive near fields, because I really don't even recommend worrying about it, but just so you know, if you have an 80 meter dipole strung from some trees in your backyard, if it's not 44 feet up in the air, you can't use this FCC calculation, because people will be walking under it. And this is the calculation. It's a very simple one, almost something you can do in your head. But again, you might fail the calculation and still be within the limits. Now, there's a lot of things you have to think of when you do a calculation. I won't go into it too much. You're all probably pretty good at transferring from dB to power. The FCC often, or almost always, uses dBd. dB with respect to a dipole for antenna gain, but a lot of manufacturers report their gain in dBi. So you just have to make that conversion of 2.14. There's feed line loss that you can look up. There's transmitter power, which you might have to convert to dBW to do your calculations. And then you get an ERP, and then you need to use that back into the equations of what exposure is. But let's get off this FCC exemption, because I don't think it's really worth your time to use it. So I won't even talk about this. It's there. If you want to use it, go right ahead. But and I ran through an example once to show how you could use it and it could fail, and then you could fix it. But let's not worry about that at the moment. Let's go on to the one that we recommend, the AWRL RF Safety Committee recommends, is to use the AWRL Calculator. So let me go to that. They use this calculator for their HTs. Well, that's not valid by the FCC rules. Any HTs within 20 centimeters or 8 inches of a person have to be done by SAR. I'll talk about that a little later. And here's what you have to do, and I'll do one for you. Power at the antenna in watts. So let's say you have a 100-watt transmitter, and you don't want to go to the trouble of figuring out how much gets lost in your coax. You could, but you probably don't need to. So let's just say 100. And you're a guy or a girl who likes to talk on sideband, and that's all you ever do. And you don't use speech processing, because speech processing will give you more amplitude in your signals. That's the compression. So you sound louder at the other side. But let's say you don't do that, because conversational SSB sounds a lot better. So that's a 20% duty cycle. That means that of that 100 watts, only 20% of that is exposing a person. And now let's say I talk to my friend, and we usually go back and forth, and I talk for 5 minutes, and he talks for 5 minutes, and then it comes back to me, and I talk for 5 minutes, and back and forth, and back and forth. And I have a 3-element Yagi, and it's, let's say it's about an 8 dB gain roughly, and that's 8 dBd gain over a dipole, but in dBi I'll add 2.14, but let's just rough it out to say 10 dBi is the gain of my Yagi. And then the frequency. Now the frequency is only important as you saw in that curve before, in determining your exposure limits. Let's say I'm on 20 meters a lot. So let's say 14.2, good enough. Now, you can or cannot include ground reflections. It's most accurate to include them. So I leave that checked all the time. And then all you do is you hit calculate, and it tells me for control that is me and my family and the people in my house. All I need to know is the minimum compliance distance in feet from this Yagi, which happens to be on a 60-foot tower, but is 2.86 feet. So unless someone's flying around up there, they're not going to get overexposed. That's all I need to know. For the uncontrolled, let's say I got a neighbor comes and walks through my backyard, it's just under 5 feet. So again, this neighbor is going to be far away from my Yagi. Well, you can repeat this for all the different bands you use and different antennas. And you just repeat it as many times as you need. You saw how fast this was to do. You repeat this for as many antennas as you have and as many different bands as you use. And let me show you an example. Let's say I go to 10 meters. My SSB, 28.5, I'll recalculate. So now, for me and my family, it's 5.7 feet, and for the guy walking through my backyard, it's 10 feet. Now that's still safe with the height of my antenna, and that's an important point, that if you find that your antenna is not high enough, or you're using more than 100 watts, and let's try that, let's say 1,000 watts. I won't go up to full maximum, but let's say 1,000. Now we're talking some distances. 30 feet, still good with my tower, but if you have a roof-mounted tower, then this might be a concern. If you have a 10-foot roof-mounted tower, and there's people inside the bedrooms on your upper floor, under the roof, they may be within 18 feet of that antenna. So these are the things you have to think about. It's not just the guy walking through your backyard. Okay, so this is easily usable. In the end, after you run this, you click print results. You print as many copies or as many different situations as you have, and you file that away somewhere, and you are in good situation in case anyone ever complains about your station. The FCC doesn't come around and check up on you. They wait for a complaint. But irregardless, if they were to ask you, this is good, you just send them these papers you printed out, and they'll be happy. They're not going to double check your calculations. They'll just say, you did what you were supposed to do. Okay, let's go back to the slides. Actually, what was my drop dead time? Quarter of?
Yep. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so I got 10 minutes, so let me get through these real quick. May not have time to do the biological stuff, but I'll show you one slide that I like, that's biological. Okay, so the calculator I just showed you uses this equation. This is called the far field equation. And in essence, what it says is, in the far field, far away from your antenna, these are the power levels, and this says, in close to your antenna, it's pretty accurate as well. It's not exact, but it's pretty accurate. But that's how those calculators work online. Now, what if, and of course this is what I just showed you online, so it's a better way to go. What if you find that you have an antenna that's not passing? Well, one of the things I mentioned before is that far field equation is saying that your gain, especially if you have a gain antenna, your gain is the same in all directions. It's not that smart to know that it's only the main beam. It doesn't know that underneath your antenna, you're not in the main beam. So it tells you a distance that is as if you were in the main beam. Now that's obviously wrong, so what can you do about it? Well, you can go online, www.easynet.com, download a copy of EasyNet, which is now a free program. W7EL made it free, and when he retired. And it's fairly easy to use. And you can model your antennas to your heart's content and find out what the real exposure is around your antenna. Not just something that's kind of a scratch pad calculation like the online calculator. Another thing you can do, and I'll just talk very briefly about this, is do measurement. Measurement is actually not that easy to do. There's a lot of measuring devices you can buy, but unless they're calibrated, and you have a calibrated antenna, and you know how to use it, and it's not easy to use because some of my colleagues do that for a living, and it's not easy to use them to get accurate results. But if you know someone that's got that equipment and knows how to use it, or you read about it and learn how to use it, it's another possibility. Probably the most accurate possibility for you. Now, your calculations don't have to be exact. All you have to do is say that you're under the limit. So if you make, as I did, as you saw me, I put in 100 watts or 1,000 watts in the calculator. Well, I don't really have 100 watts in my antenna because I have a fairly long coax run, at least 60 feet up the tower, and I do have hardline, but I run the hardline all the way the length of my house. So there's some loss there. And all that loss is going to do, it's an inexact calculation for me, but it's inexact on the safe side. It's saying that I'm transmitting more power than I'm really transmitting. So if I do that and my exposure is still in the safe limits, I don't have to really bother with that. But if you don't do that, or you find that you have people who are being exposed more than they should, you might want to throw in some of those things that let your exposure drop a little, like the loss in the coax. Now, multiple transmitters, you don't need to know much about it because most of us at home don't do that. But there are FCC rules about that. Mainly, if you find that your exposure from your transmitter is more than 5% of the limit, of the exposure limit, the MPE, then you have to account for that along with all the other transmitters that are there. That's usually something that repeater owners might consider if they're located in a place with other transmitters. Not so much at your house. Just keep in mind that the FCC doesn't want your evaluation, but you should keep it handy. And you should keep it up to date. If you can buy some new equipment, get a new antenna, move your antenna, keep that up to date. Now, this is important. I'm going to spend a minute on this and then go on the last minute to the other thing I said. Positive access control, that's what the FCC requires. And again, they're now treating all transmitter operators the same, hams and broadcasters and cellular people and everything. And they talk about positive access control. If you find that there's a spot in your yard, let's say, where if someone from the general public were to walk through that spot and stand there for long enough, which would be 30 minutes for the general public, that they would be overexposed, then you have to mark off that area and keep them from walking there. Not just stand there and yell at them to go away. There has to be a fence and a sign and a warning. So the best thing is that's a mitigation. And the best thing is we don't like to do that. So the best thing that you could do is figure out other ways so that you don't have any spots like that you would have to fence out. One of them might be to raise your antenna. Might be a good excuse to put another 10 feet on your tower. Or another one would be to, which is not as popular, is lower your power a little. And one of the things that we've been negotiating with the FCC people who wrote those rules, and we got them to agree that ham radio is not exposing if it's not operating. So if we said, well, if you're sitting looking out your window and you see someone walking in that spot that you know is a high exposure spot, and you stop operating until that person goes away, you are well within the rules. You don't have to put a fence up then. So that is something that a mitigation that they made for hams. They allow it for other things too, but especially for hams. And we made the argument that we're different than a broadcaster. We're not transmitting 24 hours a day, and we are most of the time sitting with our equipment. So we can do things like that. Okay, so HT. HT is the other problem. Let me go to something else. Well, let me just say it. In QEX July 2021, one of my colleagues, Rick Tell, wrote. He went through the FCC database. He wrote an article that went into QEX that said that for an HT, which we can't analyze an HT because we can't do SAR, it's very hard. And in his article in QEX, he compared to all the non-amateur HTs, the ones the police use, the firemen use, and whatever's in the FCC database, and he found a lot of them that are in frequencies very close to ham frequencies from manufacturers that make ham HTs. And the good odds are that if they do that, then if they pass at those frequencies, they didn't change their radios to make it for hams, they just reprogrammed it. So we can use that as our evidence that we're meeting exposure. All right, so there is a supplement B for radio amateurs on the FCC website that is going through review. A lot of the RF Safety Committee members wrote parts of that, and someday you'll be able to look it up on the FCC website, but it's going through all the red tape that things have to go through right now. All right, let me go to a different, I'm going to show one slide or one or two slides from a different presentation, then I'll quit. Is drop dead, or is that still time for questions?
Well, we can leave one, a couple of questions.
Okay, so let me show this. This is from a talk I gave. I don't want to do that one. No, I'll use this one. I gave it. I taught a course at the University of Arizona, and I had the slides from that one, but I can't find them this moment. But a lot of them are the same. So let me move on to these other slides. Just for your own peace of mind. Okay. Oops. Let's see. This is not working. So let's get out of there. Are you seeing a green slide?
No.
See your face right now.
Okay, let's try that again. How about
Gray
Yeah,
one.
we see it.
now? Green, okay. Let me get down to the, I just want to show you, okay. These, this is from the government's cancer registry. It's called the SEER registry. I used to work in brain tumors, so that's why this is something I track all the time. And this is about cell phones, but it applies to RF. This is the number of cell phones from 1986 until 2015 that have been in use in the United States. And this is the incidence of gliomas, which is the worst kind of brain tumor you never want to get. And as you can see, and this data is US government data that you can also get from the American Cancer Society, it has been dropping. And you would expect that if there was any causality, if the cell phones were causing brain tumors, then this might not go up as high as this, but you'd see a shape like this. It would be going up, it wouldn't be going down. So what about other cancers? This is for all cancers, and the scientists separated by sex, but you can see that there was a peak for a slight rise in all cancers for females, big peak at a time, I'll talk about that quickly, and then a drop off of all cancers, and the same thing for both sexes. Let me break that down. This is all the different cancers from 1975 to 2016.
The slide didn't change.
And you can see if cell phones were introduced in 1985 and grew the way that graph showed you, there is nothing here that would represent a causality, something that goes up because of the cell phone. I'll talk quickly about prostate cancer. There was not, and this one scared me when I first saw it because this is.
Greg, I'm not sure the slide is changing.
Okay, are you, public health trends?
Okay.
Is that what it says?
Yep.
And it's got a yellow curve at the top on the left?
No.
No? Okay. What do you, no? Tell you what, let me,
We're not seeing the slideshow, we're just seeing the piece of the
okay,
PowerPoint.
hang on, let me,
Yeah, we're kind of running into the question time, but yeah.
okay. I wanted you to see this, so. Okay, I'm showing my whole screen instead of just the app. Does that help?
There we go.
Okay, so the yellow line up on the top, this is the men's side, the right is the women. Prostate cancer, 7 or 8 years after cell phones were introduced, there's a big peak in prostate cancer. And that even scared me when I saw it. But then you can see it's gone down over the years as it's gone up. When I looked into this, I don't know how many of you go to the doctor every year and get a PSA test, but this is when the PSA test was invented, or at least introduced. PSA is prostate specific antigen, and it essentially is a blood test that tells you have prostate cancer. And they started using it. It was a new invention, and all of a sudden they started finding a lot more prostate cancer than they knew about. So, that's what this was the cause of this, not the cell phones, not RF, but because they got a new test that was suddenly discovering more prostate cancer. And then, of course, that has dropped. Okay, that's all I need to show you. Let me stop sharing, and if there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Yes, we have. Go ahead.
Out of all the years he's been doing this, does he know of any instance where amateur radio caused a health problem to a human being?
Do you know of any instances where amateur radio has actually caused a health problem for a human being?
The only kind of chance of that, I don't know of any specifics, and we've been trying to look into that in the military, but if people were to come up and touch your antenna, they could get burns. Clearly, this is another level, but the burn is the most likely danger from any RF, but especially a ham with a lot of power, or in the military. And we've been talking to the military doctors recently to see if how the military deals with that. They say it just doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting. So being in the diagnostics world, the prostate cancer test is an interesting one because that's commonly recognized as being one of the worst diagnostic tests in the market. And what happened is when the physicians first started using it, they took it as the gold standard. But as soon as they appreciated how poor it was, they started doing other follow-ups and started using it sort of in a different way. And it's still, if somebody can figure out a good way to measure in blood prostate cancer, it's worth a huge amount of money because a lot of people and companies have died trying to figure out how to do that. Yeah.
Though clearly from that graph, you can see that it had some effect when it was introduced.
Yeah, the test, from the test, right, right. Are there last question in the room? Were we kind of, okay. Greg, thank you so much for joining. We have your email and how to get a hold of you if there are any questions. I'm seeing people nodding in the room that you may get some feedback that way and some questions as well. But thank you once again. Really appreciate the presentation.
I enjoyed it.
Good.
I enjoyed talking to you all, and I hope you will don't hesitate to contact me if you have questions.
Great. If you're ever up here on the second Monday of the month, please drop in and join us.
I
Not
will
that
do
far
that.
away. Right.
Right, go
Okay.
Packers. He's a Packer fan, right?
You're they want to know if you're a Packer fan.
I know Packer fan.
Well, maybe you can stay down.
I'm a baseball fan.
There you go.
But
Okay.
it's the Cubs, not the Brewers.
Great. Thank you.
Cubs, not the Brewers.
All right. Thank you, Greg. Have a good night.
You too.